The first thing everyone noticed was the sound, the sharp metallic click that didn't belong in a hospital, slicing through the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of monitors like a blade through cloth, a sound that made conversations die mid-sentence and turned breath into something people suddenly had to remember how to take. Danielle Carter stood frozen near the nurse's station, her scrubs still creased from a 12-hour shift, one hand clutching a patient chart and the other lifted instinctively, palm open, as if calm itself could be shown physically. The white police officer facing her, Officer Mark Reynolds, had his gun half raised, not fully aimed but close enough that no one in the emergency wing could mistake what might come next, his jaw clenched tight beneath the brim of his cap as his eyes flicked between Danielle's face and her hands with a suspicion that felt practiced rather than earned. Around them, the emergency department seemed to shrink, the wide hallway narrowing into a single point where fear gathered and thickened, where a hospital supervisor named Linda Morales hovered near a supply cart, whispering, "Sir, please, she works here," while a security guard, James Whitaker, stood rooted by the double doors, unsure whether stepping forward would help or make everything worse. Danielle's heart pounded so loudly she wondered if anyone else could hear it, and in that pounding she felt the weight of every story she'd ever heard, every warning given by family members about staying calm, about surviving encounters like this by making yourself small, non-threatening, invisible. "I'm a nurse," she said evenly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I was called to assist with a patient." But Reynolds didn't lower the weapon. Instead, he barked a command for her to step back, accusing her of interfering, of not following orders, words that made no sense in a place where her badge and uniform should have spoken for her. Time stretched unnaturally, each second heavy and loud, as patients peeked from behind curtains and staff held their breath. And Danielle realized with a cold clarity that this moment, this misunderstanding, this raised gun, could redefine her life or end it altogether before anyone could correct the story being written about her in that officer's mind. Officer Mark Reynolds' voice echoed too loudly in the emergency wing, sharp and commanding, cutting through the sterile calm the hospital was designed to maintain, as if volume alone could establish control over a space that wasn't truly his. "Step back, now," he repeated, his finger tense near the trigger, eyes narrowed with a suspicion that seemed to ignore the obvious, Danielle's ID badge swinging from her pocket, the name RN clearly stitched into her scrubs, the way other nurses hovered nervously nearby, ready to vouch for her but too afraid to speak out of turn. Danielle took a slow step backward, just one, careful not to move too quickly, aware of how easily the wrong motion could be misread, her shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor in a sound that felt unbearably loud. Linda Morales finally found her voice, hands raised slightly in a placating gesture as she edged closer. "Officer, she's one of ours," Linda said, forcing calm into her tone. "She was assigned to the trauma room. There's been a mistake." Reynolds didn't look at her. His gaze stayed locked on Danielle, jaw flexing as though he were chewing on an argument only he could hear. "I got a call about someone refusing to comply," he snapped, someone matching her description. The word description landed heavy, unspoken assumptions hanging in the air, and Danielle felt heat rise behind her eyes, not from tears but from anger she couldn't afford to show. James Whitaker shifted by the doors, clearing his throat, but stopping short of intervening, his training battling his instincts. A patient's monitor began to beep faster somewhere behind them, an unconscious reminder that real emergencies were unfolding, even as this one spiraled. "I didn't refuse anything," Danielle said, her voice measured, each word chosen with care. "I asked why my patient was being questioned without medical clearance." Reynolds' eyes flickered, irritation flaring at being challenged, and for a split second his gun lifted higher, enough to draw a gasp from someone behind a curtain. "You don't tell me how to do my job," he shot back. The air felt thinner now, charged, and Danielle sensed the room tilting towards something irreversible, the kind of moment people later replay in their minds, wondering at which second it could have turned another way. The tension thickened until it felt almost visible, a heavy film settling over the emergency wing as staff and patients alike became unwilling witnesses to a confrontation that no one seemed able to stop. Danielle could feel sweat gathering at the base of her neck, not from exhaustion, but from the knowledge that she was being evaluated not as a nurse, not as a professional, but as a perceived threat. And that realization carried a sting sharper than fear. She glanced briefly toward the trauma room she'd been called from, where a middle-aged man lay unconscious after a car accident, his life balanced on careful monitoring and swift decisions, and the guilt of standing here while he waited pressed down on her chest. "Officer," Linda tried again, stepping closer despite the warning look James shot her. "We need to clear this hallway. Patients are—" "Stay where you are," Reynolds snapped, his attention snapping momentarily toward Linda before snapping back to Danielle, as if any movement in his peripheral vision confirmed his worst assumptions. The badge on his chest caught the light, polished and official, and Danielle wondered how many times it had commanded obedience without question, how rarely it had been challenged. She took another slow breath, reminding herself of every de-escalation training she'd ever been through, every lecture about tone and posture and patience. "No one here is resisting you," she said carefully. "We just need to make sure the patient is safe." The word safe seemed to land wrong, triggering something defensive in Reynolds, whose shoulders stiffened as though the concept itself were an accusation. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his voice low now, dangerous in its quiet. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, a collective unease as the situation teetered closer to violence than protocol. James finally stepped forward half a pace, his hand hovering near his radio, torn between his duty to hospital security and the reality of confronting an armed officer. "Mark," he said cautiously, using the officer's first name in an attempt to humanize the moment. "Let's just slow this down." Reynolds shot him a glare, and for a heartbeat, Danielle saw how fragile the balance truly was, how easily pride and fear could collide in a space meant for healing. She straightened slightly, lifting her chin, not in defiance but in resolve, knowing that whatever happened next would echo far beyond this hallway, carried in memories, reports, and the unspoken understanding that this was never just about one nurse or one cop, but about who was believed and who was allowed to be afraid. The hospital's automatic doors slid open somewhere down the corridor, letting in a brief rush of cold night air and the echo of distant sirens, a reminder that this building sat at the intersection of care and chaos, where authority and vulnerability collided every day. Officer Reynolds shifted his stance, boots spreading slightly apart as if grounding himself, his training asserting control even as his patients frayed. "I'm not here to argue hospital policy," he said, voice rising again, loud enough that heads turned farther down the hall. "I'm here because someone interfered with an active investigation." Danielle felt the accusation land like a weight on her shoulders, absurd and dangerous all at once. She resisted the urge to gesture toward her scrubs, toward the name badge that clearly read Danielle Carter, RN, knowing how easily even a small movement could be misread. Linda Morales swallowed hard, glancing between Danielle and the officer, calculating risk with every breath. "She followed protocol," Linda said, firmer now. "If there's an investigation, it goes through administration. That's standard." Reynolds let out a short, humorless laugh. "Standard doesn't apply when someone won't listen," he shot back, eyes flicking briefly to the cluster of nurses who had gathered, their faces pale, their hands clenched around clipboards like shields. James Whitaker's radio crackled softly at his hip, a call he ignored as his gaze stayed locked on Reynolds' gun. On the way, it hovered just shy of fully raised, a threat made potent by restraint. Danielle felt time stretching again, the minutes since the confrontation began blurring into something unreal, and in that stretched moment, her thoughts drifted to her brother, to the late-night phone calls where he warned her about situations like this, about how quickly a misunderstanding could turn deadly. She hadn't planned to think about him now, hadn't planned to lean on that connection, but the thought rooted her, reminded her that she was more than the fear pressing in from all sides. "I didn't interfere," she said quietly, each word deliberate. "I advocated for my patient. That's my job." Reynolds' jaw tightened, the muscles in his face working as if he were restraining something volatile. "Your job doesn't give you immunity," he snapped, taking a step closer that made Danielle's pulse spike and drew a sharp intake of breath from Linda. The space between them shrank dangerously, the line between authority and abuse thinning to almost nothing, and as the room seemed to collectively brace for what might come next, Danielle realized she was standing at the edge of a decision she'd hoped never to face, one that would change the trajectory of this encounter in ways no one present could yet predict. Officer Reynolds' step forward felt like a closing door, the kind that locks with a final, echoing click, and Danielle's instincts screamed at her to retreat further, to create distance, but there was nowhere left to go without turning her back on him, a risk she knew better than to take. The hallway had gone eerily quiet, as if the hospital itself were holding its breath, the usual rhythm of rolling gurneys and murmured updates replaced by a heavy stillness, broken only by the faint buzz of overhead lights. Reynolds' voice dropped again, low and edged with something that made Linda's stomach twist. "I said step back," he repeated, though Danielle hadn't moved since his last command. James Whittaker finally spoke with more urgency, his calm cracking. "Mark, this is getting out of hand. Let's call your supervisor." The suggestion landed like an insult. Reynolds' eyes flashed, and his grip on the gun tightened, the knuckles of his hand whitening. "Don't tell me how to handle this," he barked, the word "don't" stretching thin with warning. Danielle felt a strange clarity settle over her, a stillness born not of calm but of necessity. She thought of the patients behind her, of the unconscious man in trauma, of the oath she'd taken to do no harm, and the irony that she might be harmed simply for doing her job. "I'm standing right here," she said softly. "I'm not resisting." The words felt inadequate, fragile against the weight of a weapon, but they were all she had. Reynolds' eyes flicked once more to her hands, then to her face, as if searching for confirmation of a threat that refused to appear. Somewhere a phone rang unanswered. Linda whispered Danielle's name, a plea and an apology woven together. And then Reynolds crossed a line that made the air snap. He raised the gun fully, not yet aiming, but no longer pretending restraint, his voice sharp and final. "If you move again, I will shoot." A collective gasp rippled through the hallway, fear blooming openly now, and Danielle felt her heart hammer so hard it bordered on pain. She knew in that instant that compliance alone might not save her, that reason and credentials and calm had all failed to reach him, and as the reality of her vulnerability crystallized, she understood she had seconds to choose how this story would continue, seconds to decide whether to remain silent or speak a truth that could either end the threat or inflame it beyond control. The words, "I will shoot," seemed to hang in the air long after Reynolds said them, vibrating against the tiled walls and settling into Danielle's chest with a cold, suffocating weight. And for a fleeting moment, she wondered if this was how people described time slowing down. Not dramatically, not like in movies, but quietly, cruelly, as your mind races ahead while your body remains trapped in the present. She became acutely aware of everything at once, the faint smell of antiseptic, the crease in Reynolds' uniform sleeve, the way Linda's hands were trembling despite her effort to stay composed, the subtle shift of James Whittaker positioning himself slightly between Reynolds and the cluster of nurses without fully stepping into the line of fire. Danielle's thoughts flickered to her childhood, to long dinners where her mother had warned her and her brother about moments like this, about staying alive by staying careful, about how dignity sometimes had to be swallowed whole. But standing there now, with a gun leveled at her existence, Danielle felt something else rise alongside the fear, a sharp, defiant awareness of how unjust this moment was, how wrong it felt to be seconds away from death in a place built to save lives. Reynolds' breathing was audible now, fast and shallow, his face flushed as adrenaline overtook training, and Danielle realized with a jolt that he was spiraling, that control was slipping rather than tightening. "Mark," James said, again, voice firmer, closer. "Lower the weapon. She's not armed, she's not moving." Reynolds didn't respond, his eyes locked on Danielle as if she were the last obstacle between him and restoring his authority. A patient cried out somewhere behind a curtain, a reminder of the fragile human lives intersecting with this standoff. Danielle swallowed, her throat dry, and spoke again, not louder, not faster, but clearer. "You don't have to do this," she said. "This will follow you." The words weren't a threat, just a statement of fact, but they landed heavily, and for a brief second doubt flickered across Reynolds' face. It was in that fragile pause, that narrow crack in his certainty, that Danielle felt the weight of her final option pressing forward, the truth she had never wanted to use as a shield. Her voice, when she spoke next, was steady despite the fear roaring beneath it. "Officer," she said, meeting his eyes, "I'm the governor's sister." The hallway didn't explode into chaos. Instead, it collapsed into silence, a profound, stunned quiet, as if the building itself had stopped breathing to hear what came next. The silence that followed Danielle's words was so complete, it felt unnatural, a vacuum where even the hum of the lights seemed to dim, and for a long heartbeat, no one moved, no one spoke, as if sound itself had to ask permission to return. Officer Reynolds' expression shifted in slow, unmistakable stages. First, disbelief, his brow furrowing as though he'd misheard. Then calculation, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion now, but in sudden awareness. And finally, something close to fear, raw and unguarded, the kind that slips through before pride can pull it back into place. "What did you say?" he asked, though his voice had lost its edge, the threat draining out of it like air from a punctured tire. Danielle didn't repeat herself immediately. She simply held his gaze, her hands still visible, her posture unchanged, refusing to soften or retreat, letting the truth sit where it had landed. Linda Morales let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, one hand flying to her chest, while James Whitaker instinctively stepped another half-step forward, emboldened by the sudden shift in momentum. Reynolds' gun dipped, not fully lowered, but no longer aimed at possibility, his wrist loosening as doubt overtook certainty. "The governor?" he said again, quieter now, glancing around the hallway as if expecting someone else to confirm or deny what he'd just heard. A murmur rippled through the gathered staff, shock and recognition mingling as pieces fell into place, Danielle's last name suddenly heavy with meaning. "Her ID," Linda said quickly, voice steady now that fear had loosened its grip. "Her last name is Carter." Reynolds swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly as he looked back at Danielle, the authority he'd wielded moments ago now colliding with consequences he hadn't considered. The room seemed to tilt again, but this time away from violence and toward reckoning, the unspoken understanding spreading that this encounter would not end quietly, no matter how carefully it was handled from this point forward. Danielle felt the adrenaline still coursing through her, her legs aching with the effort of remaining upright, but she didn't feel relief, only a hollow, aching clarity. The gun that had threatened her life moments ago now hung uncertainly at Reynolds' side, and in that shift, she saw the truth laid bare. It wasn't her uniform or her words or her humanity that had stopped him, but her proximity to power. As Reynolds finally lowered the weapon fully, clearing his throat and taking a step back, Danielle knew the silence in that hallway wasn't peace. It was the sound of a story changing direction, of witnesses realizing they'd just seen something they wouldn't be able to forget. Officer Reynolds holstered his weapon with deliberate care, the click of metal against leather echoing far louder than it should have in the stunned quiet of the hallway. a sound that felt less like resolution and more like punctuation on a sentence no one had wanted to read. He straightened his uniform, a reflexive attempt to reclaim composure, but the effort only highlighted how completely the balance of power had shifted, his earlier certainty replaced by a strained politeness that hadn't existed minutes before. "Ma'am," he said, clearing his throat, the word landing awkwardly between them, "there's been a misunderstanding." Danielle watched him closely, noting how his tone softened, how his posture opened, how quickly respect appeared once danger to him entered the equation. "I was responding to a call," he continued, glancing briefly at Linda and James as if seeking allies, "and things escalated." Linda's jaw tightened, her silence louder than any rebuttal, while James folded his arms, eyes steady, refusing to let the moment be rewritten so easily. Danielle felt the anger she'd suppressed begin to surface, not explosive, but heavy, settling into her bones. "You threatened to shoot me," she said evenly, the words calm but unyielding, refusing to let the reality be smoothed over. Reynolds flinched, the truth landing squarely, and for a moment it seemed he might argue, but the weight of the witnesses, the context, and the name he now understood better held him in place. "I need your supervisor here," Linda said, her voice firm, no longer pleading, "and we're filing an incident report." Reynolds nodded stiffly, reaching for his radio with a hand that shook just enough to betray his nerves, calling in for a lieutenant with clipped, formal language that contrasted sharply with his earlier aggression. As the machinery of accountability began to creak into motion, the hospital slowly resumed its rhythm, footsteps moving again, hushed conversations breaking out, though the atmosphere remained charged, eyes following Reynolds with a mix of caution and disbelief. Danielle leaned briefly against the counter, the adrenaline ebbing and leaving exhaustion in its wake, aware of the looks she was receiving, not just sympathy now, but curiosity, reassessment, as if her identity had expanded in their minds in ways that complicated what they'd just witnessed. She straightened, pushing herself back into the role she'd come to fulfill, because patience still needed her, even as the echo of that raised gun lingered, and she wondered how many similar stories ended differently simply because the person standing where she stood didn't have a last name that changed the rules. The arrival of the police lieutenant brought a new layer of tension to the emergency wing, one wrapped in official calm and carefully chosen words, as if professionalism alone could smooth the jagged edges of what had just occurred. Lieutenant Harris was a tall man with graying hair and a measured demeanor, his eyes taking in the scene, the cluster of staff, the shaken nurse, the rigid officer, before settling on Danielle with an assessing look that lingered a moment longer than courtesy required. "I'm told there was an incident," he said, voice even, hands resting loosely on his belt. Linda Morales didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, recounting the sequence of events with precise clarity, her voice steady but edged with restrained emotion as she described the drawn weapon, the threat, the way Danielle had remained compliant throughout. James Whitaker added his account, filling in the silences with details no report could soften, and as they spoke, Danielle watched Reynolds shrink subtly, his earlier bluster replaced by the guarded posture of someone realizing how exposed he'd become. When Harris finally turned to Danielle, his tone softened. "Miss Carter, would you like to add anything?" She nodded, choosing her words with the same care that had kept her alive minutes earlier. She spoke of advocating for her patient, of confusion turning to fear, of the moment the gun was raised, her voice unwavering, even as her hands trembled faintly at her sides. Harris listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of discomfort crossed his face when her last name was spoken aloud again. "We'll need written statements from everyone present," he said at last, casting a brief look at Reynolds that carried unspoken implications. "And Officer Reynolds, you're relieved from duty pending review." The words landed with a quiet finality that rippled through the room, drawing a sharp breath from Reynolds and a murmur from the onlookers. As he was escorted away, the hospital felt altered, like a place that had just witnessed something foundational crack, and Danielle felt a complicated mix of validation and sadness settle over her. relief that she would walk away from this encounter, and a heavy awareness that the outcome might have been different had she not spoken those 6 words that changed everything. Hours later, long after the emergency wing had returned to its familiar rhythm and the incident reports had been filed and signed, Danielle found herself alone in the staff lounge, the harsh overhead lights dimmed, the scent of stale coffee lingering in the air as the weight of the night finally settled in. She sat at the small table with her hands wrapped around a paper cup she hadn't touched, replaying the confrontation in fragments, the raised gun, the silence, the look on Reynolds' face when the truth had landed, each memory surfacing uninvited and sharp. Linda Morales stopped by quietly, offering a tired smile and a reassuring squeeze of Danielle's shoulder before leaving her to the quiet, while James Whitaker poked his head in later, his nod of respect carrying more meaning than words. Danielle's phone buzzed with a missed call from her brother, the governor's name flashing across the screen in a way that made her chest tighten, and she let it ring out, not ready yet to explain how his title had become a lifeline in a moment it never should have mattered. When she finally stood to leave, the hospital halls felt different, familiar yet altered, every corner holding the echo of what had nearly happened, and she wondered how she would walk these corridors tomorrow, carrying both the knowledge that she had survived and the uneasy truth of why. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin, grounding her as she took a deep breath and stepped into the quiet parking lot, the building behind her glowing softly against the dark. Danielle knew the story would spread, shaped by reports and whispers and headlines, but the version that would stay with her was simpler and heavier, the understanding that her life had been spared not by fairness or protocol, but by a name that forced the room to listen. As she drove away, the hospital shrinking in her rearview mirror, she held on to one certainty. She would return to her work, to her patients, carrying the memory of that silence with her, a reminder of how close the line had been and how much still remained unspoken.